I was originally approached to do this presentation, and I don't know if I can repeat the original title I had. I can say it once, can I? Without too much pain. I did originally suggest a title, Resilience on the Cheap. And I was told that might not be politically correct, and in the wrong hands it might be misinterpreted. So that's the underlying message of my presentation, although of course this isn't resilience on the cheap, this is resilience of a very high quality and of an excellent standard, which may or may not be good value for money. We're going to hope it's going to be the former. I'm going to really sort of do this in a couple of parts. Let's start off with this idea of resilience as the prevention, and then look at resilience as dealing with something that's actually gone wrong. I picked up this slide not so long ago from the internet, and it made me laugh. It was on bus stops all over London around the time when Barclays were having a little bit of a problem regarding their LIBOR rates, and various chairmen had to leave the bank because of issues to do with whether they were fixing rates or not. And I just thought it was rather interesting that another part of the organisation, the marketing wing of the organisation, was at the time actually advertising. I think they were talking about mortgages here, but you can see how this could suddenly get misinterpreted or misconstrued. And this is the problem with risk management, that we try to take the risk out of the system, and we often find it comes back and bites us in a different way, often in a way that we couldn't have imagined it would come back at us with. And in the backdrop to, while this was going on, I've been working with Eve and a number of other people, Ken, Rob McFarlane. We've been working on developing something called PAS 200, which is the world's first ever attempt at a standard for crisis management, or a guidance document for a standard for crisis management. And part of that's to look at consequence management. And in my mind, I keep thinking to myself, well, if you're trying to do consequence management, you have to accept in your mind that risk management will therefore fail. Which makes it a rather difficult venture to go out and do risk management, because you're thinking in your mind, this is going to fail, so why am I doing this if I'm going to be actually concentrating on consequence management? And my argument today is you do both, not you do one or you do the other. And if you do them well, not only will it improve your resilience, A, by reducing the number of things that go wrong, and also enhancing your ability to respond to things that go wrong, but it will also enable you to do what you do in everyday life more efficiently and to a higher standard of quality. If you look at standards as a tool for, we all work for organisations that are involved in compliance of one kind or another, and we can see a number of features that kind of develop good standards, corporate social responsibility, marks of quality. These are organisations we can trust and deal with, and they've got the rubber stamp, and we can understand why that might be a desirable thing. And look at the typical risk strategies that you might go through in order to achieve those sorts of standards. Identify the risks, consider the impacts, develop contingencies, exercise and test plans, and developing exercises as well. These are typical strategies for going about risk management, and they're good strategies. You should do these things. I'm not saying don't do these things at all. The problem is you're now ready to fail, because you've gone through the process, you've done the risk management, you've created the product, and then something goes wrong, and you're standing back in awe thinking, oh my God, that shouldn't have happened, because I've done everything I could to prevent that happening. Now what do I do? Do I throw more of the same resources at this problem that I originally produced for the risk prevention, or do I have to change my tack altogether and do something completely different? Here's risk management in action. You'll note the fluffy little thing on the bottom left-hand corner of the picture, and they're looking in the wrong direction. I personally wouldn't want to stand on that Land Rover, but maybe he knows better. Look at the processes you go through and you start to understand why the process falls down. Tick box. I work in a university. Lots of people send forms around all the time. In fact, 65% of the people on the payroll are now employed to either collate forms, make sure forms are filled in, or design the forms that we have to tick as they go around trying to prevent us from doing things wrong. That's a massive change. 20 years ago, 80% of us were doing the research, the teaching and the lecturing. Now only 35% of us do that, because 65% of us are doing the tick box shuffle. Go to the NHS, same problem. Same percentages, 35% are actually medically trained. The other 65% are preventing things from happening. The system doesn't work. It's not delivering value for money. It is preventing things. Certainly, every time you do something to prevent something, you're making something happen. You're causing a reaction. But you may not be actually reducing the total amount of risk. Risk myopia, we just saw this with the fluffy creature. But the other problem is the organisation itself part of the problem? If the organisation is part of the problem, then risk management actually isn't something that you add on to an organisation. It should be actually the management of the organisation. Risk for me is an infinite number of problems with a finite number of resources to respond. It's a bit like the word management. If you looked up management in the dictionary, it originated from the Italian word to ride a horse or something. But the actual term management is about dealing with infinite problems when you have finite resources to respond. It's very similar to risk. So therefore, if we want risk management to be effective, it's got to be part of the management structure, not something that reports to the management structure, not something that is in a porter cabin somewhere or in a little diverse bit of the organisation where you have to go where there's a problem, but otherwise you ignore them and let them fill in their forms and so on. Dealing with the problems, frequency versus impact. We can go around our organisations and we can look for things that go wrong, count out how expensive they are and how often they happen. And depending on the answers we get, we will decide whether we do something about them, ignore them, or try to change the processes altogether. Problem with frequency versus impact, almost impossible to predict some of what are described as black swans, things that go wrong that are just so out of the ordinary. We're hearing the discussions at the moment about flooding and properties built in floodplains. The best one I've heard in the last couple of days is, I've lived in my house for 80 years. There's never been a flood. My grandfather lived in this house. This house has been lived in for 130 years. There's never been a flood. There's a floodplain down the road that always used to flood, but since Barrett built a housing estate there, they put flood defences in. Now my house floods. You just move the problem around in the system. You don't actually take the problem away. Second problem, assumptions. Our assumptions about safety and danger are typically highly irrational. If you look at the academic literature in psychology, the last 50 years is littered with attempts to understand risk and irrationality. Why is it that perfectly rational people do totally irrational things? If you don't believe me, drive down the motorway, look for someone in a four-wheel drive on a mobile phone, not hands-free, ringing their loved one to say, it's all right, I got the organic chicken from Waitrose, we're safe tonight. It's out there, wall to wall, assumptions about what's safe and what's dangerous. The things that kill us are the things that are most likely to bore us to death, like cancer, strokes, heart attacks, driving too fast and using your mobile phone. And also, if we're looking at frequency versus impact, if you look at some of the big things that happen, the Fukushimas, the Chernobyls, Chernobyl had an impact, a frequency of 10,000 to the -6. It wasn't meant to happen. So you wouldn't really have it on your register as a list of things to do in your tick box. Contingencies. If X, then Y. So if X happens, we've got a contingency plan, we pull it out the drawer, we apply it, and the problem goes away. The problem is, with risk identification, we can only produce plans for risks that we can identify. We can't produce plans for the ones that we didn't identify in advance. And if sometimes our risk management plan has collateral damage, which is new kinds of risks that we hadn't thought of, then we're going to find that we're not going to have the suitable Y to apply to our X. Certainly we can prepare key individuals and teams, but the danger here is a potential culture for optimism, what the military used to term this idea of throwing too many resources at the same problem, rather than changing the way that you apply those resources. We need to prepare individuals and teams to be able to react to events, but we need to be able to prepare them to react in ways that might not fit a particular rule set. And that's the real problem, because people like simple rules to follow. Tell me what to do, I do it, I can defend it, I've done it according to the rule set you've given me. What we're finding in this increasingly complex and difficult world, and an austere one, is that the solutions often require changes about the very assumptions of the rules that we're given in the first place. The idea of one service working with another service. I can remember 20 years ago battling against the emergency services who refused to see the value of working together on training exercises. They thought it was quite acceptable for the fire brigade to sit in front of computers learning how to deal with fires, the police service to go off and run their exercises on their own, and the ambulance service to do their own thing. And I've even been to exercises where they had to debrief separately because it just was so unpleasant for the three services to be in the same room at the same time after they'd tried out their systems. Today, it's common to see these services practicing together. That's a real plus. But it's taken years to get to that level. We need to see that more in industry too. We need to see that in not just the profit sector, but even more so, I believe, in the not-for-profit sector, where the real savings are there to be made. If 65% of people in my organisation are doing things that weren't done 20 years ago, it's quite obvious what part of the £9,000 fee is going towards that. And if anybody here is a parent thinking about paying that fee, you may have a strong view on that. I do. And I work in one of these places too. Test. We know the reality is never the same. It's the last point I particularly want to make. There used to be a company called Anderson's Consulting, a very big company in the world, and they used to do accounting and auditing and all sorts of other types of management consulting. And what did? They broke the cardinal rule. The people that did the accounting should never do the auditing because there's obvious problems. Yet, in the world of risk and crisis and resilience, the people who sell you the business continuity plan then come along and say, we'll sell you a test as well. What does the test do? It tells you that the plan that they sold you worked. It won't test whether what you're like when your plan doesn't work, which is precisely what you need if you're going to prepare for a crisis situation. I believe we should actually have a law about this, that the people who sell you business continuity risk management plans should never be allowed to test them. We should have different people who test those plans, just to get some blue water between those two organisations. Disadvantages with an over-reliance on risk prevention. It's a cost on the system. It's a very significant cost on the system. It may be so expensive that the system no longer is able to operate. And we actually aren't able to provide the things that we originally used to be able to provide. I'm increasingly seeing that in my sector. Standards may conflict. We may see minimalist compliance. And it obviously favours those that can afford the certification. The danger here is death by management. And the point that I really want to make this morning is quite simply, risk needs to be management, not a kind of process that's added on to management. And that's why risk is becoming such a burden. In the private sector, I think there's almost a distinction, such a distinction between the private and the public sector, that when I look back at the standard for crisis management, that we almost need two standards, one for each sector. I think the private sector is probably less risk averse than the public sector. And you can see that in the efficiency in the way that the private sector is able to deliver things often much more efficiently than the public sector can. Not because people don't work hard or people aren't well-meaning in the public sector, it's just that we are naturally risk averse as organisations. And then we've got to deal with these things. Population growth, systemic failure, complexity. Everything in the world now is connected to everything somewhere else. In the introduction this morning by Christine, talking about what was going on in Europe, we are affected by stuff that goes on over there very, very strongly, as we affect things that are going on there in turn. Everything is connected to everything in the world. It's amazing. I was in Abu Dhabi about a year and a half ago, learning about how jellyfish around the mouth to a pipe could be affecting gas supplies here in UK. Little things happening in other parts of the world affect us. We're all in this big complex system together. We can't disaggregate ourselves from that. And our expectations have been increasing all the time in the last 30 to 40 years in terms of our expectation that we live in a risk-free environment. Maybe we need to take some of that responsibility for risk management back. And I think there's been far too much of a push of top-down, imposing, and there needs to be more of a bottom-up push from the bottom. What do we need? In other words, how do we make risk management something that's meaningful to the people that are actually having the risk affected? I thought this would be a nice picture considering where we are today. It's an artist's impression, obviously. But I mean, how realistic is that? If that were to happen, do we have a risk management plan? Do we have a plan Y that we could just pull out of the drawer and say, that'll make it go away? I suspect not. I suspect we'd be in rather big trouble. The wheel's safely all right, though. We can go back in history. This is not a new problem. Aristotle, the one thing we can expect is the unexpected, and we should expect it. And it keeps coming back and biting us in the bottom to remind us that we should expect the unexpected. The ancient Chinese were talking about this 5,000–6,000 years ago, the I Ching. So, in terms of crisis management, what's the value of doing crisis management as well as doing risk management? Well, to start with, if we look at risk, we know it means different things to different people. So what does good look like? How do we change from a risk-averse to, if you like, a risk-accepting culture, a culture where we accept that we need to take responsibility for risk and actively manage it? And there was a lovely piece of work I saw years ago looking at high-reliability systems. And how do these high-reliability systems constantly deliver high-reliability results? And there were 2 minutes, thank you. There were 5 things that they specified. Move away from looking at things that have gone wrong and look at things that have gone right. We spend far too much time looking at failure. What we learn from failure is how bad organisations reach the natural conclusion. It was in Turner's book in 1978 that organisations typically will, given time and energy, will just fail. It's the nature of the business. Organisations need to be able to reconfigure themselves when they operate in high tempo. Private industry is very good at doing that. Public industry is really bad at doing it. Try to get anything done urgently in a university, and I'll tell you, we can get chairs action in 6 months' time. We can get a committee organised and get the right people around it, but they may be out of the country at the time. Communication patterns need to be vertical and horizontal. We tend to find in most organisations they're either one or the other. It's either a flat organisation that's totally horizontal, or it's an old-fashioned organisation and the information goes up and down. Expertise rather than rank. This is why it can't be top-down. Who are the people that often have the solutions? They're probably people right down there amongst the bottom. But they know the business, they know what the problem is, they actually often have the answers. But it's enabling them to talk to each other and to be able to make the decisions. And by looking at these healthy systems that have crises and overcome them, we can also learn from them. In terms of my own experience, what I found is that every single successfully managed crisis was successfully managed because the people broke the rules in order to get a good response. Now that flies completely in the face of risk management, which is about conformity to rules and following the rules to the nth degree. 1 minute, wind up. What is required is a study of risk that treats people as part of the process and not people that tick boxes and are little bits in a giant system. We need to make public systems more risk-seeking, and we need to make private systems perhaps a little bit more risk-averse, maybe. I'll skip a couple of slides, and I'll go to there, because I think we're running out of time. Thank you very much.